Well, I'd like to start by thanking Mel for taking us to the dark side. How many people here have had a bet online or in a bookmakers in the last year? Put a hand up, please. I'm impressed. You see, this will reflect my talk. It's an interesting division. So, are you perhaps someone who supports irrational recreations or irrational risk? Are you a person who goes for vice or virtue? Are you a person who goes for respectability or the unrespectability of gambling? Do you go for conspicuous consumption? Are you careful with your cash? And you know, do you look to the bookmaker or the bishop? I'm trying alliterative tactics at the moment. Are you a church goer or a pub goer? Because that sort of division we see there reflects the traditional divisions over gambling and the views of British society right through the interwar years and actually through the war, both the First and Second World Wars as well. So, is it gambling in the time of war? What did people think of it then? What was its place in British society in those war years between 1939 and 1945? How do I get this over? Press it down. No, it won't do it.
Yeah, it will.
It will. It's all right. I'll go the other way. Right. What can you look at to find out about gambling? If you want to do a PhD on this, there is a huge amount of material. You can look at the mass observation surveys, which start, from the 30s. You can look at the parliamentary discussions in Hansard, and you'll see debates about gambling running through the war years. If you look at the parties, the Conservatives by and large are pro-gambling. The Liberals have mixed sort of views. The Labour Party, interesting, despite being the People's Party, and the people mostly do like gambling, are the party most opposed to gambling right through this period. Many of the Labour Party come from Protestant, non-conformist backgrounds, and their view of gambling is extremely negative. We can see the files of the Church's Council on Gambling, which has taken over the role of what was the National Anti-Gambling League, which was the powerful organisation in the first decades of the 20th century. You can look at newsreels who talk about the pools and so forth quite regularly. You can look at the files of the British Home Office, the Cabinet, other official records, sports organisation minutes like the FA or rugby, who all have attitudes to gambling. There are betting surveys, there's substantial coverage in the print, there's editorials, anti-betting sermons in the church, there's crime reports. I could write at least 3 PhDs on this topic just for the war years. So there is plenty therefore to go at. And where do I want to start? Well, always start at the beginning. Let's just have a couple of very brief stories. 1940. The German bombing attack on the airfields of southern England is on its way out, and the Derby is run. Not held at Epsom like it should be, but held at Newmarket, out in the country, well away from many big urban areas. There is still maybe 60,000 people attend, despite the petrol shortages and rationing and all the rest. And the newsreels cover it, and they use it as an icon of Britishness. And you hear the German Stukas, you hear Hitler ranting away in the background, and in the midst of all this, you see the race finish. And Rule Britannia and all the whole thing is a beautiful, metaphor for English resistance to the Nazi jackboot. And it finishes with, well, that's won the race, now let's win the war. So you can see the message there. Or let's take another little story. Stories are illustrative, aren't they? 1942, Salisbury racecourse, one of the few racecourses the government is now allowing to be still open and running, to keep racing alive. By now, all the iron is being collected everywhere. People are tearing up the railings. That lovely garden you had with its, lovely rails is all, the rails have disappeared. Your pots and pans have been, no more cooking pots and pans taken in. All the gardening equipment is disappearing off to be melted down for the war effort. This is bollocks. But it doesn't matter, because that's how it is. And of course, then the people of Salisbury, in the midst of all this great effort, look to the racecourse. The racecourse is surrounded by metal rails. And it's got a grandstand covered in rails. And at that point, they can see the target ahead of them, collect all the iron in the racecourse for the war effort. And the churches have a campaign to get the metal from the racecourse in. The jockey club, the local aficionados of racing, write their letters to the press. The letters go backwards and forward. The local paper prints them all. This is the greatest thing that's happened to Salisbury in years. And at the end of the day, they failed to collect the railings. The government say they don't want the railings. Salisbury is one of the few race courses still allowed to run, and they're going to keep it. It would be bad for morale if the course couldn't run anymore because all the railings had gone. So both of those have little messages about a sense that racing, at least as one gambling medium, may be important. So let's come back to morale. If you look at literature on morale in the war, from about 1950 onwards, historians created the view that British morale during the Second World War was high. By and large, they have a positive message to tell. There are debates about what morale is, how it might operate, the visible signs, invisible signs, how you might assess it, how you might measure it. So historians are looking to discuss it, but what they decide in general, right up to the 70s and the 80s, is that generally they're painting a very positive image of British morale. But by and large, they don't talk about recreation at all. There's very little on things like the role of the cinema, any of the leisure activities, the sport that's going on during the war years. And then after a while, a revisionist position starts to appear in the work on morale, and that begins to tease out some of the complexities, some of the subtleties, the nuances about how morale might have worked during the Second World War. They point to the activities of black marketeers and so forth, and they begin to argue that morale wasn't this sort of oversimplistic image, and that they need to look at some of these complexities in things like recreation, and we start to see work on things like the cinema and so forth. And in a sense, I'm picking up on this now in looking at betting as another example of how betting might have functioned as a positive role at a time of wartime, when everything is bad and you want a little lightness and excitement. Maybe that element of risk in gambling, the possibility which you can't get through your job at that time and the long hours, that possibility, maybe just that little big win for 1 week, when your 15-to-1 shot comes up, might have had a positive role, and the extent to which the government might or might not have thought that. So I began to try and look at that. Okay, so down there what we see is that betting had changed by the time of the Second World War. There had been a whole series of new betting innovations. The first, of course, keeping an eye on time always, was the football pools. The football pools, the first pools really start to come on in their modern form about 1921-22, which is when what will be Littlewood's firm starts to develop. By the early 1930s, the pools are growing. By the 1938, they're already playing a massive role in British society. Men and women sit down together sometimes, to fill in the pools coupons. People purchase lucky charms that might help them to win the pools. It's become a function, and looking for the football results, even for those who aren't interested in football, becomes a big thing on a Saturday. People buy their postal orders and send them in during the week, And another one, of course, is the mechanical dog racing. Up to that time, the main dog racing form had been hare coursing on open fields with two dogs competing against each other. Not to catch the hare, incidentally, although clearly they do sometimes. By and large, they never did catch the hare for more proportioned times. But the competition between two dogs, with the judge giving marks for the way the hares actually carry out the activity, being the main betting form. Places like the Waterloo Cup and so forth. But then mechanical dog racing comes in first in Manchester in 1926 and then spreads through the country from 27, 28 onwards. We've got the standard forms of betting. We've got the new form of betting in British racecourses, which is the totalisator, which Ray will know all about. Which again comes in about that time. So betting is changing, and actually it's becoming more popular in British society. The proportion of people's spare cash spent on betting is going up from round about maybe 1 or 2% to about 5% of recreational spending. So it's becoming more significant. But within that, of course, you've got these divisions of cultural attitudes to betting, different class resentments, different. For example, upper class jockey club might be one attitude, as against the pools is a different sort of attitude. You've got class resentments, you've got religious faith, particularly non-conformity, with the Church of England much more mixed position, whereas Catholics in general were much more accommodating to betting. You've got political leanings, as I've said before, with the Labour Party, particularly the ILP group being particularly anti-betting. So what you have is a complex matrix of shifting consideration and interests. So when the war starts, and all these forms of activity on which betting is based, horse racing, dog racing, the pools and so forth, then they become a focus for debate, because each of them are problematic in terms of British society in 1939 once the war starts. Okay. The first we really, they're all, at first everything is majorly affected. All horse racing initially closes down because they're afraid of bombing. Dog racing closes down. These are in urban areas quite often, and the Germans are going to fly over tomorrow and bomb the hell out of them. So initially everything closes down. And of course, we have the pools. Littlewoods, for example, just one pools company alone, out of many pools companies at this time. All very large, the big, maybe 30 large pools companies and others quite small. But Littlewoods alone employs about 23,000 women, 23,000 women and maybe several hundred men. It's a major, on its own it is a major employer in Liverpool, quite apart from, Vernon's and all the rest. It's shut down. And of course immediately there are debates about this, and of course it's attacked for all sorts of things. Those who are opposed to gambling hit that because we've got to think of a new argument. We haven't managed to stop the pools before. Let's find a new way of attacking it. Equally, there are those who are for the war effort who want to attack it anyway. And it's argued that people shouldn't be working on this when activity should be turned to the war effort, that it's a huge waste of paper, it's a huge waste in terms of the post office, it's taking scarce resources and being put on vans and driven around London and everywhere else. The post office is taken up with selling postal orders and cashing postal orders and all the rest, and it should be stopped. How long did that last? Lasted about 2 months. At that point, the government's being lobbied by the pools companies and by those elements in British society who want the pools back. And very quickly you see a new form of pools, unity pools, emerge, which is very beneficial for Liverpool actually, because unity pools, what a misnomer that is, because it kicks out most of the pools companies. Unity pools is actually Littlewoods, Vernon's, and about 7 or 8 others, who now publish their coupons in the newspapers. Now, isn't that a waste of paper? No, because the newspapers are struggling to find advertising during the war. They have to fill their columns somehow, and they need advertising payments. So the Unity Pools companies will pay the newspapers to put the coupons in, and then these coupons are collected on a regional basis and work from there. So that reduces the cost in all sorts of ways. So Littlewoods quite quickly starts to play a new role in unity pools, meanwhile giving up much of its factory space for things like parachutes. It starts to manufacture parachutes in much of its now non-used plant. So Littlewoods becomes an one of the first interesting cases. Meanwhile, dog racing and horse racing are still struggling because they're still banned, but quite quickly the government starts to think again. And you can see what happens throughout the rest of the war, and I'm summarising briefly rather than giving a detailed account of the changes. What you see is, that if we start with the figures, Greyhound National Tote turnover, which is 40 million in 1938, drops to 32 million in 1939, and then it starts to go up again. And that's because, although the government shuts down all the dog racing initially, quite quickly it starts to open them up again. First of all, it says each of these grounds can only open 1 day a week. But equally, it says they have to operate during daytime, which then stops any costs of nighttime and so forth. But what happens is that more people go, more people spend money, and you can see the figures there quite clearly. You're seeing a quite sharp rise. From 40 million in 1938, there's diminution initially in 1939, thanks to the war beginning later in the year, down to 30 million in 1940, but after that it's coming back up again quite quickly. It's back to interwar levels by 1941, it's grown to 50 million in 42, 74 million in 1944 at 104 tracks, and there's racing 1 day a year for much of the war. So you can see significant in rail-like statistics, and I think these are quite illuminating statistics about the place of dog racing in British society, and it's actually changing its nature. Equally, although there are lotteries that disappeared by and large in Britain, they're still operating in Ireland, and you can see there that there are still British winners in the Irish Hospital sweepstakes. These are coming over from Dublin and being sold in pubs and elsewhere, and people are still buying them. And you can see it was about 50% before the war, it's 37% in 40, and then by 1945 it's back up to over 50%. The Irish sweepstakes sold in America, in Europe and the island, obviously, so 50% is quite a significant amount. Football pools have changed to unity pools. Again, you're seeing a drop and then a rise again, but nowhere near pre-war levels, and that's because of the difficulty of organisation and collecting. By and large, it's much more difficult to do it. So the pools do suffer more than anything else. And of course, horse races are fewer. 1939 there were 331 days of racing, 1940 152 days, and by 1942 80 days and only 5 courses. So, but people are still able to bet. What we forget is that Ireland, because its era is neutral, and they're still having races on Irish tracks, and the newspapers are constantly publishing details of racing results. But it's not just English racing, it's Irish racing too. Equally so, you have many of the papers throughout the war have a forecast for the racing, they have betting forecasts for dog racing, and they equally have lots of pools materials. So newspapers do not stop publishing their predictor data. Nearly all newspapers have betting forecasts and things, and it's there right the way through the war. It's still a major element of our sort of society. So yes, racing does particularly well, but not in the way it did. It's surviving in different forms. So you wouldn't have thought that if you'd read the press or looked at the media, because when we looked at the division here, about 50% of you betted, about 50% of you didn't. But some of you might have been in that list. A relatively small group of folk who are very active in opposition to gambling. And the group who are opposed to gambling before the war, groups like the Church Council, Committee Against Gambling and so forth, the old anti-gambling groups across society, are very vociferous. They make a lot of noise. As we know from our students, lots of noise does not mean lots of noise does not necessarily mean great significance. And what we see here is that there is, from those groups who opposed betting before the war, ally themselves to see any activity in recreation which is not devoted to the war effort as unpatriotic. So you have two different sets of arguments. You have the arguments which are the traditional arguments of the anti-gamblers, which are to do, first of all, with its immorality and its irrationality and its damage to families, wasted resources, impact on crime and so forth. So they're the traditional arguments, and I don't want to rehearse them particularly. You know, we would find them if I was writing about gambling at any point in the past. But there are also the arguments which now both anti-gamblers and some of those people who want every bit of our effort devoted to the war effort and the completion of the war coming together, playing off each other, feeding off each other. So for example, you see some of the arguments against the hair coursing, for example, which is now, people will know, has been banned since 2005. Well, you see the same arguments then about its cruelty to the hair and so forth being advanced then, but then they're allied to people, people gathering out on Alcar near Liverpool when they should be devoting the time to other things. And we can see cars there, and they develop a series of arguments about that. And then there's a third group which sees that betting might be okay, but all the profits should go to the war. And again, I haven't got time to deconstruct this in detail, but you can see how there might be some rationality by saying the profits shouldn't go to these private companies. We need to almost nationalise this, and we should have a sort of pools, but Littlewoods shouldn't get the money. All this should go into war bonds or something like that. So there's a series of arguments about gambling as a rational this is a rational argument, isn't it? About contribution to the war effort. Then you have the traditional ones, the immoral ones. But then they find a new argument, which is a patriotic argument about gambling as wasteful. And gambling as wasteful is a really interesting one. First of all, they say gambling is wasteful because it wastes acres of newsprint. Open your paper. Take a look. Look at that. There's pages. There are all these coupons. There's the guy giving his tips for Newmarket and tomorrow. And what about this? Suggestions as to where you should put your CrossFit pools there, or a report on the dogs with predictions for the Haringey Arena. And there, so look at the amount of paper that's wasting. Appalling. And then and petrol. Here we are. Even doctors cannot get money for running the cars because they have to apply, they have to get it. And now look, there's that racehorse trainer. He's got his 2 horses and he's driving all the way from Newmarket to Salisbury, miles, wasting petrol. Look at that dog. He's got his dogs and he's taking them from Haringey right the way across to Wembley. Waste of petrol. So we start to get a whole discourse which is all about materiality being exploited for non-war purposes. Wood pulp being wasted, and then of course there's the whole lazy scroungers argument, which is about these people should be at work. Are they at work? No. every bit. Nobody should be doing anything which is not part of the war effort. And there are people attending race meetings. There are people attending dog meetings, and these are the dregs of society. People like Ray Van Plume or me going to the races. It's appalling. And you can see how difficult that image is to. Because it sounds a very sort of powerful, a very powerful image. It's the whole thing is a squandering of war resources, which should be devoted to sort of other area. It's Bison Roundtree, who's the big name, social reformer, Joseph Roundtree. He says, well, that neither too patriotic or too occupied with war work to neglect their popular business. They say they're providing a much-needed relaxation for the overworked masses, and a short-sighted government complacently acquiesces while Britain's being destroyed by vice and greed. So there's and you get a bit of this even in the occasional newsreels. There's a Pathy newsreel from 1941, and the commentary, which is fascinating to watch and listen to. He says it's difficult to believe that these tens of thousands of war workers who could be spared in midweek, and they're watching these ration-fed thoroughbreds, these poor horses, the ration-fed thoroughbreds, and that use of petrol to bring in thousands of cars it can't be helpful to the war effort. It's flying in the decent face of decent public opinion, says Manny Shinwell. What he would say, that Manny Shinwell, remember the Labour MP, to support such inane, insane and unseemly spectacles. So there's this argument going on all the time about. I can't find the quote, but there's a beautiful one somewhere where this bloke says, well, I looked and this is when in the car coming away from the cars coming away from Epsom. This is a real great quote. Were full of Jews and foreigners. So we've got anti-Semitism and racism. How the hell you can see what's in the car and tell the Jews and foreigners? God only knows. Well, he would, wouldn't he? But that sort of discourse, which is which is racist, which is Semitic, anti-Semitic, there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on alongside. So there's a whole range of things. And one of the things, of course, is the fact that they're enjoying themselves. So enjoyment becomes almost something disapproved of. And people are enjoying themselves rather than devoting themselves to ending the war quicker. And when you read it, you can see that this is a deeply felt feeling, and it is one which catches the mood of some of the British people. As I say, and you find it in things like even like occasional newsreels, as in much of the press. And yet. Even occasional government people start to pick it up. Stafford Crisps, you remember, he was a big name at that time in the government. By the time we get 1942, when Britain's still, struggling to survive, the war is still not going well in 1942. And Stafford Cripps says, who doesn't like dog racing, he says it's completely out of accord with the true spirit of determination of the people. They shouldn't be allowed to offend the solid and serious determination of the country to achieve victory. So there's still this rhetoric, even in some figures in government. But that is not the government view. It's not the dominant government view. Because the government does see that betting can have positive things too. And alongside that, by 1942, the press is starting to shift. It starts to develop new arguments which become much more foregrounded than previously about the extent to which the anti-betting arguments have the power which they appear to have for a short time. For example, people start to point out that, hang on a minute, all this waste of paper. Well, have you not seen cinema adverts every week? Every paper's full of cinema adverts. Isn't that a waste of paper too? Are you going to take that out? What about all the church adverts? They start to go, what about football? Football prints admission tickets. It has programs every week. Are you going to stop all those as well? Hang on, you can't just pick out your betting. You've got to pick out the rest. They point out too, yes, transport's used for horse racing. We say it's another entertainment form. Transport used for all the other things. When people go to the theatre or cinema, they use public transport. Isn't that a waste of time? Are you going to ban that as well? They pick out the notion that spectators should be at work, and they start to deconstruct and provide evidence for the type of spectator who's actually at these dog races and horse races and so forth. Instead of just accepting what the anti-gambling arguments say, they start to break down the argument and provide evidence to say, actually, that is not the case. And they show that quite often it's weekends, it's half days, bank holidays when racing's on. Quite a lot of spectators are local. Quite often they're in uniform, and nearly all of them are attending in their own time, not in work time. Why shouldn't people be allowed to spend time out of work on leisure activities that they choose? Other writers point out again that resources are used by all animals, including pets. So instead of accepting the fact that these dogs are having, or the horses are being fed rations which should be going to people, they say, well, hang on, have you got any pets? Do you have a dog? Do you have a cat? Do you have a gerbil? You've got a gerbil. So quite slowly over that period, by 1942, the arguments against gambling, which were what I call the patriotic arguments, as against the traditional moral and social, are being challenged with data. You see regularly you get cartoons in the press which still feature gambling during the war. I just provided this one, this is meant to be the bookmakers always had, we're always portrayed as corpulent, smoking cigars, being bejeweled, carrying his binoculars and so forth. Was hitting pretty hard. He used to walk back the races. Now he has to walk both ways. It's because there's no petrol anymore for him to get there, presumably. You can't. This is again the document which I got the Derby thing, where it says we agree with the authorities that war workers should have occasional recreation, but we find it difficult to believe that these tens of thousands are war workers who can be spared. So I don't need to read you that, but that's the sort of material you get when you go to places like Pathé and get the words often in their original form when they were typed out. And this, of course, is an attack on Crips. And in a sense, it's ironic because here you have these dogs that now aren't killing hares, and the two dogs are saying to themselves, one day that Crips, the guy who was complaining about dog racing, may turn us loose into a real field with a real hare. So that sort of excitement there. So it is quite ironic. So what you're seeing is that the government starts to be much more vociferous, really from about 1941 onwards, up through 1942 and into the early 1943, about why they should continue to maintain a gambling industry in the face of wartime. Local authorities don't withdraw dog licenses. They could. Local authorities have the chance to withdraw a dog licence for a statement at any time. The fact is, they didn't. If local authorities had wanted dog racing closed down, it didn't need government. It can be done by any local authority withdrawing its licence, just as with the pub. BBC continues to provide racing results and commentaries on dog and horse races. The Home Secretary attacks anti-gamblers for pushing personal opinion and personal intolerance. He says betting is a lubricant and not a brake on the war machine. So the Home Office, who traditionally had been fairly, non-committal about gambling because they wanted to be straddle the fence. They didn't want to offend anti-gamblers, nor did they want to push gambling too hard. Either was dangerous. Both lost votes. Whichever way you jumped, it's a bit like salsa, isn't it? Whichever way you jump, you get. It was dangerous. So by and large, the Home Office had tried not to say too much about gambling. It now, Morrison's being much more outspoken in a way, is supporting gambling much more than previous, Home Office ministers had. He says betting is a lubricant and not a brake, and the derby is being seen as iconic. And again, we get the same sorts of argument from the government as being coming before from the general public about all these sorts of things. Okay. Well, why did betting survive then? I think it's fairly clear. Government couldn't accept that betting needed regulation. In other words, to be controlled during the war and managed during the war, but they didn't want it. They didn't want it to be banned. What they wanted to do was reduce the amount of resources used for it to within a reasonable level, but maintain it consistently. The other thing is the class argument. What you see emerging in the Home Office documents, particularly, not in public, but in the documents within the Home Office, what you read is that that more traditional feeling, for example, where the racing was supported by the jockey club, and the jockey club was run by the rich, the aristocratic, the powerful, many of whom had places in the House of Lords, and were always able to get the ear of government, and often could influence government, for example, to maintain racehorse breeding during the war. The Home Office is aware of that sort of political power for the jockey club, but they're anxious not to make the people, in inverted commas, feel that the government's on the side of the elite. That that people are equally important, and that we should. What we don't want to do is that betting is treat one betting form differently to another. If we ban dog racing, we've got to ban racing too. In that sort of sense, that betting has a clear class dimension, but they don't want to intervene in class terms, even though I know they're a government, a national unity, but they're a conservative government in many ways. That class feeling comes across very much in the Home Office documentation, where you see the sort of marginal comments and things. The Ministry of Home Security says bans would not be in the national interest, and they did help morale. The Ministry of Agriculture, you see, each group's intervening from a position of its own departmental strategy. So the Ministry of Agriculture said, well, we could actually cut the fodder for horses and dogs, and if we did that, it would save half an egg per person a year. Do you want to do that? They start to make it sound ridiculous. The relationship between jockey club and government's good, and the thoroughbred breeding industry seem to be a national asset. But again, although the anti-gambling organisations, the churches, lobby the government regularly through the war, and they lobby the public regularly during the war, they simply largely put forward the traditional anti-gambling views about, as I said, about its morality and about its possible social consequences. They don't come up with anything new, so their lobbying has little effect. But what you also see is all the betting organisations, Littlewoods and all the rest, have a much closer relationship with the government, and they provide information, they provide lobbying to the various governmental departments quite consistently. So they're trying to make their case alongside the anti-gambling organisations in a way which had been growing through the interwar years, but now becomes more significant. And the other thing, of course, is they're also very publicly help the war effort. They make great plays, for example, whether it's the various race meetings or the dog racing organisations. They give charity donations quite regularly to the war effort or the hospitals, and they publicise these like mad because publicity helps their case. And you see consistent charity donations, but very well publicised in the local press. So a local race meeting will say, well, the first race today, and the selling of programmes will be given, all the money will be given to, and so that's very consistent. Or they let the premises or the grounds be used to help, and they make them available. So Littlewoods, as I say, are a prime example in letting their factories be used for other war purposes. Equally, many of the stadiums do things where official activities are allowed to use the stadium for war-related purposes. Okay, so I'm nearly finished. I want to just finish with one, that gives you a sense of the morale side. But one thing I haven't talked about, and that's because I can't, is I know almost nothing about who bets during the war. People, you know, I keep asking myself, well, I've got all this data about it, but I don't know much about actual betting. I have the figures, but individuals and that data disappears, and the reason for it disappearing is because when I wrote about gambling in the interwar period for work I've done, for example, horse racing, you can find out about who gambles because you have data. You have the police, for example, prosecute betting ritually quite regularly. Ready money betting is illegal, but everyone does it. And what the police by and large do is once a year they'll prosecute that bookmaker, and the rest of the time they'll leave him alone. Partly because he pays, sometimes he bribes them, but quite often it's just a ritual prosecution. So when you have the prosecution, you know, they often identify people. So you know the sorts of people who are caught in gambling, anti-gambling operations by the police. When people win on the pools, you get the list of the pools people, who they are, where they came from, what jobs they did, how old they were. So for all sorts of reasons, there's plenty of data about who's been gambling. Now, in the war, you have that data disappears. First of all, the police stop prosecuting gambling. That's not because it's not happening. The police see their role. Since many of the police force have joined the army, and the police that's left is a shadow of his former self. They find that they have to make contingent decisions about what they address and what they don't, and they don't address gambling. Very, very rarely do they do it. And when they do, quite often magistrates dismiss the cases. Because they say, why are you doing this? You should be doing something else. And quite often you see magistrates being very unsympathetic to gambling prosecutions, even though it's legal. So I can't get data on that side of things. I can't get data on who wins. Although I know that the Irish hospital sweepstakes, there are winners, by and large the papers don't print it because they're reserving the print, which is now scarce, and the paper, which is now scarce, for more important, inverted commas, war news. So I know a lot about the debate, I know a lot about the statistics and the figures, I know very little at all about the world of gambling during the war. Nearly all the data which would allow me to access that area has disappeared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I'm just tweeting that if you want any help on that, then somebody should get a hold of you. Okay. All right, any questions for Mike? Yeah, Mark, then Alison and Alex. Mark?
Thanks very much. On the topic of who was betting, it strikes me that actually the war was a heyday for betting because you had civilians and particularly airmen who were living sort of riskier, chancier lives, who maybe were more of a mind to sort of gamble.
Well, you see, if you look at the army, there always been gambling in the army, and you see that right across history. That and in Palestine during the war, they're running pools for the army in Palestine, for example. So and in a sense, people come into the army carrying over the betting experience from civilian life into the army. So you're absolutely right. The army's rife with gambling, but again, we have no data on it. I can see it's going on from occasional references, but the amount of data is quite minimal.
Alison?
I was interested by a whole load of things in that book, but one thing that piqued my interest was the Irish reports on Irish racing. So I think that, the movement or the interconnections between one country and another are really interesting.
That's right.
So I'm interested to hear a bit more about that, and particularly whether, how extensive it was, the interest in Irish racing in Britain during the war, and what the nature and tone of the reports were like, and how closely it was followed.
Well,
Irish racing goes on as it had gone on before the war, because there's no real interference with Irish racing, so the data is there. And because there's only 80 days of racing in England, bookmakers were very keen to find new ways of increasing the betting market, and so they were very keen to start publishing anti-post prices, for example, on Irish races. Most of the time, the people betting on it kind of had no knowledge at all on form, ongoing, all the sort of data that you might use to make a more rational betting decision here in England, where you had some sense of jockeys, riders going, horses breathing its past performance. But what you start to see as the time goes on is the papers start to produce some of this data in the way they had for English racing from Ireland, so which allows those that want to follow it perhaps make slightly more sensible betting decisions. So depending which newspaper you read, it differs. Sometimes it's quite minimal. It's just the racing results or which horses are running today. Sometimes there are quite detailed reports of yesterday's rating from Punchtown or wherever it might be. So it varies from paper to paper. And of course the papers with a more sporting turn of mind produce more data.
Alex?
Got like a small and a big question. Small kind of going on from Alison was, do you get the anti-gamblers sort of reinforcing it's not rational because, like say in football, you've got all these scratch teams of whichever players you can pull together, hence like how can you rationally bet, try and predict results? Do they sort of make that argument? And then sort of like the bigger question was, do you have a sense of sort of this seems to be like gambling has a good war, like sport has a good war in the Second World War. Do you have any idea of like whether gambling had a bad war in the First World War by comparison at all?
I've not really researched the First World War, so I can't answer that question easily. I do think gambling, it suffered at the start because of restrictions and everything, but what it does is it starts to reorganise itself and repackage itself and find markets it hadn't had before. And a good example is the pools, where from all accounts, and I have no data to know for sure, but the impression I get from the Church Council reports and elsewhere is that more women are filling in pools coupons during the war as a proportion. But again, it's only a I have no data except second-hand,
Sort of like observations, yeah.
Other people's observations. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that might well be the case. So I think by and large gambling has a pretty good war in the Second World War. If you look at the last figures, it allows gambling to take off again. That's why you see dog racing and horse racing after the Second World War has a boom period up to about 1949-50. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it booms because it's had a sort of flight time that's allowed it to be already on an ascending pattern.
Gary?
I'm interested. I don't research it, but the sort of international situation was the same sort of thing happening in other allies, maybe Australia or elsewhere on the continent, perhaps in general.
I don't know. That's another interesting question, which I haven't looked at at all. So I don't know.
Paul, and then Ryan.
I'm interested, going back to the political thing, that the Labour Party was so anti-gambling and the government generally was supportive of gambling. What was the main reason that the government was supportive? Was it to do with morale? Was that the key argument?
That's the message you get from nearly all their utterances. They're trying to support gambling, and they see it as having a positive effect, which is not what the anti-gamblers say. The anti-gamblers consistently say it has a negative effect upon morale, but they provide absolutely no evidence to support that.
Okay, and for the Labour Party, was it a morality issue?
What you see is that many of the members of the Labour Party came through the non-conformist backgrounds, and that's a very, if you look at those who get into the Labour Party, quite often they're supporters of temperance. Not always, but quite often they're supporters of temperance. They're quite often anti-gambling, and that comes from their youth and experience in churches, in Sunday schools. They're often sometimes as preachers in Methodist chapels and elsewhere, and so they come in with a negative negative view imbibed from that long tradition within the Protestant Church, and they carry that through. Even though they do feel they can see that their public, their voters don't support them, but they say they're taking a moral stand.
Sure.
Right?
The answer about Australia is that each state government was responsible for racing, not the national government, and they wanted it to continue because most betting in Australia was through the TAB system, which was virtually nationalised. So it was a government fundraiser. That's what Bonus National meant. Basically, the tote and the national stud were quasi-nationalised.
That's right, pretty
industry.
much.
Well, what was their experience?
And again, the tote figures go up. So you're seeing a rise in tote, even though there's less racing, even though there's less horse racing, for example, tote figures grow. Partly because bookmakers find it difficult to get around the country in the way they did before the war. So because there are fewer bookmakers, you know, the tote begins to soak up more of the money available on the racecourse. That's where, of course, the money's coming in there. The tote's only coming in from the racecourse, not from the wider bookmaking community. Outside a few offices, I know there are a few offices elsewhere.
The national stud though, because wasn't that Irish?
Yes, just about. But I've got no figures on that. Right.
Thank you very much, Mike.